That was 20 years ago, and exactly the same thing is happening again. I saw garages where 10, 20 workers would stay, and I heard incredible stories about wage theft, about sexual harassment, about the real cost of almost all of our fresh fruits and vegetables. And it was that article that led to Fast Food Nation, because the editor of Rolling Stone read that article and invited me to his office and said, I would like you to do the same thing for fast food that you did for strawberries, which is to say, take this commodity, this food that we eat, and never think about it, and show all of the forces that go into its creation. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to write about fast food because I liked eating it. And as anyone who knows me well can tell you, my food tastes are not very refined. And I really loved to eat hamburgers and French fries. And I didn't want to write an article that was just looking down at the food that most people like to eat. So I didn't take the assignment. I said I would think about it. And what I did is I went into the library and I started reading about the fast food industry and its history and its power and influence. And again, what really struck me most of all was how this industry was preying on the weak, on children, marketing highly unhealthy food to toddlers, but also how this industry was preying on workers, and how it had basically turned working at a restaurant into a terrible job, a low-pay job with no benefits, no unions, high turnover rate, how this industry had done everything it could to de-skill the workers in the restaurant industry. And most of all, how the fast food industry had fought again and again and again against any increase in the minimum wage. So even today, when you look at the fast food industry and the restaurant industry, there are about 10 million restaurant workers in the United States, and they are the largest group of minimum wage workers in the United States. And the minimum wage today, adjusted for inflation, is about 33% lower than it was 45 years ago. And what that means is, thanks to the fast food industry and the restaurant industry, the poorest workers in the United States have gotten a pay cut of 1/3, much to the profit of the fast food industry. It also led me into the slaughterhouses of the United States. And I saw terrible mistreatment of livestock, but what really haunted me was the mistreatment of the immigrant workers in those factories, those food factories, who were coming from a very similar labor pool from the migrant workers that I'd spent time with in California. And one of the moments when I knew that I wanted to do Fast Food Nation as a book was I was in the basement of a house in Lexington, Nebraska. And the house from the outside looked like this all-American house that Norman Rockwell might have painted. But in the basement, there were about a dozen undocumented workers who were living crammed together. And one of the workers had worked at a strawberry farm that I had visited in California. And I saw how the same system for exploiting poor, vulnerable immigrant workers had migrated from the fields of California to the factories of the Midwest. And however hard the work is in the fields of California, the work in American meatpacking plants is unbelievably hard and dangerous, with the highest rate of injury of any occupation in the United States when I wrote Fast Food Nation. It's no longer the most dangerous job in the United States because the Bush administration changed the categories of injuries that needed to be reported, and by eliminating all repetitive stress injuries, serious shoulder injuries, wrist and back injuries, they greatly reduced the injury rate in meatpacking just by changing the form that needs to be filled out. And the meatpacking industry has not changed a great deal since the days of Upton Sinclair, when he wrote The Jungle, because you can actually find a press release that the meatpacking industry put out celebrating the huge decline in meatpacking injuries without ever mentioning that all that had changed was the piece of paper that they were required to fill out to report injuries. So if you're an enlightened eater and you care about labor issues, it's possible now to just avoid fast food restaurants and not give money to the companies that are systematically mistreating their workers. And if you become a vegetarian, or if you decide to opt out of the industrial meat system, you can avoid giving money to the companies that are terribly, terribly abusing workers in the slaughterhouses of America. But then we come to the problem of, let's say you want to have a virtuous diet that's really the best diet for you to eat, based mainly on fresh fruits and fresh vegetables. Well, you're then going to become connected to labor abuses that are now in the 21st century that really belong to the 19th century. And I'm talking about what's happening in the fields of America. Michael mentioned a group I've been working with for more than a decade, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Immokalee is a small town in Florida in the heart of the tomato growing region. Right now, in the midst of winter, Florida is providing the majority of the tomatoes being eaten in the United States. And up until recently, there was slavery in Florida. And I thought that I saw terrible abuses in California, but the worst abuses that I've ever encountered were in Florida. Florida has a long history of being unfriendly to labor. Florida was the last state in the Union to get rid of convict labor, has been adamantly anti-union, and this new workforce of undocumented, mainly Latino workers has arrived in Florida without any real institutional support or groups helping them out until the Coalition of Immokalee Workers came along. So there were literally thousands of workers who became in debt to their smugglers and brought to Florida and traded to a labor contractor, and in order to pay off their smuggling fee, had to work for free. And when they tried to escape from the terrible working conditions in the field, they would be recaptured and beaten and literally kept in peonage. This group, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, for the last 10 years, has pursued a remarkably innovative strategy, which is to realize that the farmers no longer have power in the agricultural system, but the large purchasers of agricultural products have the real power, the fast food chains, the supermarket chains. So rather than targeting farmers, this group has been targeting the real power and has been achieving enormous and important victories against some of the biggest and most powerful corporations, literally, in the world, and forcing McDonald's, and forcing Taco Bell, and forcing Burger King to be responsible for the treatment of their workers throughout the food chain. And these victories are just the biggest victories that farm workers have had since the days of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union in the 1970s. So these are hugely significant victories. And the most significant of all this past year was with Walmart, and holding Walmart responsible for how workers who harvest food for Walmart are being treated in the fields. And at the same time that this farm worker group has been having these triumphs that I think will be written about someday in the history books of the United States, I've been trying to understand why it's been so difficult to bring attention to their work and why it's been so difficult to create a mass movement in support of farm workers and meatpacking workers and restaurant workers. Before I came here tonight, I went back and looked at the New York Times archive to see how many articles have been written about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the most significant farm worker organization in almost half a century. In the last 10 years, there's been about 6 articles, and I wrote 2 of them. And that's not because I'm a great guy. I'm not telling you it's because I'm great. It just shows how hard it is to get attention to this issue. The New York Times no longer has a labor reporter, which means that working people aren't considered as important as style, as all the other subjects that are being reported upon. Now, in the last decade, the New York Times has published hundreds of restaurant reviews, hundreds of recipes, and maybe half a dozen articles on one of the most significant social groups in the United States. And there has never yet been a profile written of Lucas Benitez and Gerardo Reyes, who I think are the 2 most important labor leaders in agriculture of the last 50 years. New York Times has never done it. Washington Post has never done it. And in the last decade, the Washington Post has written 2 articles on this subject, and one of those articles was based on this documentary I was involved in this year, and I think the article was written because the documentary has a lovely and intelligent spokesperson, Eva Longoria, in it,